Well, here we go, guys, with the incredible journey. This journey took place in the part of Canada which lies in the northwestern part of the great sprawling province of Ontario. It has a vast area of deeply wooded wilderness, an endless chain of lonely lakes and rushing rivers, thousands of miles of country roads, rough timber lanes, overgrown tracks leading to abandoned mines, and unmapped trails snake across its length and breadth. It's a country of far-flung, lonely farms and a few widely scattered small towns and villages, of lonely trapper shacks and logging camps. Most of the industry comes from the great pulp and paper companies who work their timber concessions deep in the heart of the forest, and from the mines for its rich in minerals. Prospectors work through it. There are trappers and Indians and sometimes hunters who fly into the Virgin Lakes in small amphibious aircraft. There are pioneers with visions beyond their own lifespan, and there are those who have left the bustle of civilization forever to sink their identities in an unquestioning acceptance of the wilderness. But all these human beings together are a handful of sand upon the ocean shores. And for the most part, there is silence and solitude and an uninterrupted way of life for the wild animals that abound there. Moose and deer, brown and black bears, lynx and fox, beaver, muskrat, otters, fish, mink, and martens. The wild ducks rest there in the Canadian goose, for these are the fringe of the central migratory flyway. The clear fringed lakes and rivers are filled with speckled trout, steelhead, pike, pickerel, and whitefish. Almost half the century, the country is blanketed in snow, and for weeks at a time, the temperature may stay many degrees below zero. There's no slow growth of spring, but a sudden, short burst of summer when everything grows with wild abandon, and suddenly it's fall again. To many who live there, fall is the burnishing crown of the year, with the crisp sunny days and exhilarating air of the Northland, with clear blue skies and drifting leaves, and as far as the eye can see, the endless panorama of glorious, rich, flaming color of the turning trees. This is the country over which the three travelers passed, and it was in the fall that they traveled, in the days of Indian summer. John Longridge lived excuse me. John Longridge lived several miles from one of the small towns in an old stone house that had been in his family for several generations. He was tall, austerely pleasant man, about 40, a bachelor and a writer by profession, being the author of several historical biographies. He spent much of his time traveling and gathering materials for his books, but always returned to the comfortable old stone house for the actual writing. He liked the house to himself during these creative periods, and for many years had enjoyed an ideal arrangement whereby his domestic wants were cared for by a middle-aged couple, Mrs. Oakes and her husband Bert, who lived in a small cottage about a half a mile away. Mrs. Oakes came in every day to look after the house and to cook the main meals. Bert was in charge of the furnace, the gardens, and all the odd jobs. They came and went about their business without disturbing Longbridge, and there was complete accord among them all. On the eve of the incredible journey, towards the end of September, Longridge sat by the crackling log fire in his comfortable library. The curtains were drawn, and the firelight flickered and played on the bookshelves and danced on the ceilings. The only other light in the room came from a small shaded lamp on his table by the deep armchair. It was a very peaceful room, and the only sound was the occasional crackling from the logs or the rustling of the newspaper, the pages of which Longridge turned with some difficulty, for a slender, wheat-colored Siamese cat was curled up on his knee, chocolate-colored front paws curved in towards one another, sapphire eyes blinking occasionally as he stared into the fire. As an aside, some of you may know that Mr. T and Mrs. Terrio have a Siamese cat. His name is Zuki, and sometimes I'll post some pictures of him for you guys to see. On the floor, his scarred, bony head resting on one of the man's feet lay an old white English bull terrier. His slant, almond-shaped eyes, sunk deep within their pinkish rims, were closed. One large triangular ear caught the firelight, flushing the inside a delicate pink, so that it appeared almost translucent. Anyone unaccustomed to the rather peculiar points of bull terrier beauty could have thought him a strange, if not downright ugly dog, with the naked, down-faced arc of his profile, his deep-chested, stocky body, and his whip-tapered tail. But the true lover of an ancient and honorable breed would have recognized the blood and bone of this elderly and rather battered body, would have known that in his prime this had been a magnificent specimen of compact sinews and muscle, bred to fight and endure, and would have loved him for his conspicuous mixture of wicked, unyielding fighter, yet devoted and docile family pet, and above all for the irresistible air of sly merriment that gleamed in his little slanted eyes. He twitched and sighed, often in his sleep, as old dogs will, and for once his shabby tail, with the bare patch on the last joint, was still. By the door lay another dog, nose on paws, brown eyes open and watchful, in contrast to the peacefulness radiated by the other occupants in the room. This was the large red gold Labrador retriever, a young dog with all the heritage of his sturdy working forebears in his powerful build, broad, noble head, and deep, blunt, gentle mouth. He lifted his head as Longridge rose from the chair, depositing the cat with an apologetic pat on the floor and carefully moving his foot from under the old dog's head before walking across the room to draw one of the heavy curtains and look outside. A huge orange moon was rising just above the trees at the far end of the garden, and a branch of the old lilac tree tapped in the light wind against the window pane. It was bright enough outside to see the garden in clear detail, and he noticed how the leaves had drifted again across the lawn, even in the short time since it had been raked that afternoon, and that only a few brave asters remained to color the flower beds. He turned and crossed the room, flicking on another light, and opened a narrow cupboard halfway up the wall. Inside were several guns on racks, and he looked at them thoughtfully, running his finger lovingly down the smooth grain of the hand-rubbed stocks, and finally lifted down a beautiful chased and engraved double-barrel shotgun. He broke it, peered down the gleaming barrels, and as though at a signal, the young dog sat up silent in the shadows, his ears perked with interest. The gun fell back into place with its well-oiled click, and the dog whined. The man replaced the gun in sudden contrition, and the dog lay down again, his head turned away, his eyes miserable. Why do you think that was? He thought it was time to go out and hunt, and he was a hunting dog. Longridge walked over to make amends for his thoughtlessness, but as he bent down to pat the dog, the telephone rang so suddenly and shrill in the quiet room that the cat jumped indignantly off the chair, and the bull terrier started clumsily to his feet. Longwood picked up the receiver, and presently the breathless voice of Miss Oates was heard, accompanied by a high-pitched whining note in the distance. "Speak up, Miss Oates. I can hardly hear you." "I can hardly hear you either," said the breathless voice distantly. "There, is that better? I'm shouting now. What time are you leaving in the morning, Mr. Longridge? What's that? Can you talk louder? Can't hear you." "About 7 o'clock. I want to get to Heron Lake before nightfall," he shouted, noting with amusement the scandalized expression on the cat. "But there's no need for you to be here that time, Miss Oates." "What's that you said? 7? Will it be all right if I don't come in until about 9? My niece is coming on the early bus, and I'd like to meet her, but I don't like to leave the dogs alone for too long." Of course you must meet her, he answered, shouting really loudly as the humming noise increased. The dogs will be fine. I'll take them out first thing in the morning and... Oh, thanks, Mr. Longridge. I'll be there around 9 without fail. What's that you say about the animals? Oh, you persnickety-dratted old telephone line. Don't you worry about them. Bert and me, we'll see. Tell old Bodger, bringing Marrowbone. Oh, wait till I give that operator a piece of my... But just as Longridge was gathering strength for his last bellow into the mouthpiece, the line went dead. He put the receiver back with relief and looked across the room at the old dog, who had climbed steadily into the armchair and sat lolling back against the cushions, his eyes half closed, awaiting the expected reproof. He addressed him with a proper degree of ferocity, telling him that he was a scoundrelly opportunist, a cyberitic barbarian, a disgrace to his upbringing and his ancestors, and he paused in weighty emphasis, a very bad dog. Was he really? As the two dreaded words, the terrier laid his ears flat back against his skull, slanted his eyes back until they almost disappeared, and then drew his lips back over his teeth in an apologetic grin, quivering the end of his disgraceful tail. His parody of sorrow brought his usual reprieve. The man laughed and patted his bony head, then enticed him down with the promise of a run outside. So the old dog, who was a natural clown, slithered half off the chair and stood with his hindquarters resting on the cushions, waving his tail and nudging the cat, who sat like an Egyptian statue, eyes half closed, head erect, then gave a throaty growl and patted at the pink and black bull terrier's nose. Then together they followed the man to the door, where the dog waited to fall in behind the little procession. Longridge opened the door leading onto the garden, and the two dogs and the cat squeezed past his legs and into the cool night. He stood under the trellis porch, quietly smoking his pipe, and watched them for a while. Their nightly routine never varied. First, a few minutes of separate local investigation. Then, the indefinable moment when all met again and paused before setting off together through the gap in the hedge at the bottom of the garden and into the fields and the woods that lay behind. He watched until they disappeared in the darkness, the white shape of the bull terrier showing up long after Longridge was unable to distinguish the other two, then knocked his pipe out against the stone step and re-entered the house. It would be half an hour or more before they returned. Longridge and his brother owned a small cabin by the shores of the remote Huron Lake, about 200 miles away. 200 miles, that's a long distance. And twice a year they spent 2 or 3 weeks there together, leading the lives that they loved, spending many hours ill-companionable silence in their canoe, fishing in the spring and hunting in the autumn. Usually he had simply locked up and left, leaving the keys with Mrs. Oates so that she could come in once or twice a week and keep the house warm and aired. However, you guys know when we hear an author say, however, it's time to listen up. Something significant is about to happen. However, now he had the animals to consider. He had thought of taking them all to a boarding kennel in the town, but Mrs. Oates, who loved the assorted trio, had protested vigorously and assented that she herself would look after them rather than have those poor dumb animals fretting themselves into a state in some kennel and probably half starved in the bargain. So it had been arranged that she and Bert would look after the 3 animals. Bert would be working around the garden anyway, so that he could be outside most of the time, and Mrs. Oates would feed them and keep her eye on them while she was working in the house. When he had finished packing, Longridge went into the library to draw the curtains, and seeing the telephone, he was reminded of Mrs. Oates. He had forgotten to tell her to order some coffee and other things that he had taken from the store cupboard. He sat down at the desk and drew out a small memo pad. Dear Mrs. Oates, he wrote, please order some more coffee. Sorry, my account just signed out. I'll continue later.